Chivalry 2 vs MORDHAU. Which game is the better medieval slasher game for you to play in this day and age? In this video I'm going to compare both games and highlight where their strengths and weaknesses are. The 5 categories I have picked for comparison are content, aka game modes, maps, which includes environmental aesthetics, immersion and level design. Then we have combat, character, armor and weapon customization, and developer support. Before we jump into it, I just want to say that if you're new to this channel and like this kind of content, then make sure to subscribe for future videos. Alright, let's start with the first category. How do Chivalry 2 and MORDHAU compare content-wise? Both MORDHAU and Chivalry 2's flagship game modes are the 64 and 40 player team objective modes. Furthermore, both games have a free-for-all, a last team standing, and a team deathmatch game mode. Both games also have duels and a 3v3 in a first to 5 format. In MORDHAU these are ranked, in Chivalry 2 they are unranked and without skill-based matchmaking. In terms of PvE content, MORDHAU has the edge. Chivalry 2 has a semi-PvE mode, called Beginner Mode, where only a few players are allowed to join a team, and the rest of the lobby is filled with bots. MORDHAU, on the other hand, has a fully fleshed out PvE co-op mode called Horde, where your team has to guard a noble and defeat waves of enemies that become stronger with each wave. This mode features a skill tree, which allows for different builds, and players earn gold, which they can buy armor and weapons with. But the biggest difference in content between those two games comes from the fact that MORDHAU has modding support, and the RPG element that it brings with it has become a big part of the game. There are quite a few private communities that like to hang out on modded private servers, doing all sorts of random stuff, like playing songs with in-game instruments, having a baseball game, or just messing around. Worth mentioning at this point is the Star Wars mod, that has been going strong for years now and is still actively developed. There are also some projects early in development that look quite promising, like for example an expansion mod to existing maps or a persistent RPG mod. So in our Chivalry 2 vs MORDHAU comparison, MORDHAU clearly takes the point for the content category. Next we have maps. Having well-designed and immersive maps is absolutely essential for big scale battles. So, which game has the better maps? MORDHAU's older maps weren't really designed for any specific game mode, and that shows. I think the newer ones, like Arid, Noria and Castello, are very pretty, and you can see that Traternian has over the time stepped up their map quality. The maps in Chivalry 2, however, are in my opinion one step above. Pretty much all of them are visually outstanding. The sense of scale, the textures, the lighting, everything is top-notch. Chivalry 2 also has better and more diverse objectives that tie in with the lore of the game. Objectives like burning down a library, sieging a huge castle, or freeing a prisoner and help him escape are unique tasks that you only get to do in Chivalry 2. The background story of the factions also helps to create more immersive experiences. After 2000 hours in MORDHAU, I can't even remember what the two factions are called. Another difference is that MORDHAU maps feel more like open world areas, whereas Chivalry 2 maps are more theme park. Chivalry 2 does a better job at making players fight together for objectives at predetermined areas. In terms of map variety, both games are at the time of making this video on somewhat even footing, but we will talk about development speed a bit later in this video. Long story short, the point for better maps goes to Chivalry 2. Next we have the combat. Melee combat is the heart and soul of every medieval slasher game. Certain combat aspects, like free-flowing swings with real-time tracers, different attack angles, and some form of defense, are even a premise that a game can call itself a medieval slasher game. And even though both games have those things, their melee combat systems are vastly different. I think the differences can be best visualized if you look at the combat from a defender's perspective. MORDHAU works with a timed parry system. You press parry, and your character blocks incoming attacks for a few hundred milliseconds. After that, the parry goes on a short cooldown. In MORDHAU, offense is strong, and you have designated ways to get around someone's defense. You can either hit someone before he can react, or you can delay your swing and land a hit after the parry frames end. You can also bait out the parry with a feint and land a free hit while the parry is on cooldown. The thing is, MORDHAU's combat was built for competitive play. The Traturnian developers were competitive Chivalry 1 players that were unhappy with the game back then and decided to make their own medieval slasher. A game with a high mechanical skill ceiling and combat mechanics that can be honed and improved for hundreds or even thousands of hours. When the game released in 2019, however, MORDHAU was super successful and suddenly had 60,000 concurrent, mostly casual players that expected casual fun out of the game. And having a good time as a complete newbie was indeed possible back at release, when pretty much everyone was new and bad at the game. As time went on, however, the skill differences between players grew and the entry barrier for new players became higher and higher. Today, even though Traturnian added some newbie servers to the matchmaking queue, it is fair to say that MORDHAU's combat is by no means casual friendly. A game that makes you practice chambering for 100 hours before you can semi-reliably defend yourself against a simple feint can never be called beginner friendly. And because offense is so strong and offensive mechanics can be improved for thousands of hours, skill differences between players in MORDHAU are absolutely massive. Needless to say that this cannot be healthy long term for a game without skill-based matchmaking in their main game mode. Players often complain about spinning and unrealistic moves in MORDHAU. And while I agree that certain moves look unrealistic and out of place, I think that it is not the root of the problem, and at the end of the day, it could have been any combat mechanic, no matter how realistic or unrealistic it looks. People would dislike it and get discouraged if they have absolutely zero chance in a straight up fight. Chivalry 2 on the other hand, ditched the idea of having a timed parry combat system and went with a held parry. Players can hold up their block for as long as they have stamina. This makes defense very strong, and conventional medieval slasher ways to get past someone's parry, like with feints, drags and XLs, don't really work. The combat is more focused around stamina, threatening to outstun your opponent and thus forcing him to use counters, which preserve stamina but are riskier to perform. Most damage in Chivalry 2's team objective modes, however, is dealt rather randomly in the midst of chaos, like hitting people in the back, XV1 scenarios, or newbies that simply forget to block or randomly input the wrong counter direction. As a consequence of this emphasis on a strong defense, and the fact that there is no mechanic in place that can be practiced to dominate weaker players with, big parts of the Chivalry 2 player base are on a similar skill level. There are obviously outliers, but if you look at the big picture, combat skill differences are and will always stay way smaller than they are in MORDHAU. The skill ceiling in Chivalry 2 team objective games rather comes from positioning, movement, awareness and such, rather than from raw mechanical combat skills. Alright, so if MORDHAU is so harsh to casual players, it must be a great competitive game at high level, you might think now. And well, no. Not really. Traturnian A never came up with a proper game mode for competitive play, and B, the high-level combat is too one-dimensional. Much of it boils down to practicing drag and XL mix-ups for hundreds or thousands of hours. A gameplay loop that has not enough substance to have more than a very small and niche audience. And moreover, while some casual-oriented private communities are among the nicest and most chill people you could meet in an online game, the competitive community in MORDHAU, at least in Europe, is known for its extreme toxicity. From DDoSing players in tournaments, excessive cheating, doxing and racism, there is basically every kind of negative behavior you can think of. An environment no sane person would want to be in. From a gameplay standpoint, Chivalry 2 high-level combat is not any better though. There are some clans that holds more tournaments and matches, but I don't think the competitive scene in this game has any real chance of taking off. The combat is just not well suited for that. Chivalry 2 also doesn't have a real competitive game mode that would have some form of strategic depth to it, and be interesting from a viewer's perspective. Their netcode, hit detection and hit feedback is also inferior to MORDHAU's, which is not a big deal for this game, as many casual players won't even notice a difference here. Tornbanner plays to their strengths. They deliberately went with a combat system that is very accessible. They wanted to make a game for a broad casual audience, something that is easy to pick up. And this is also why I give the point for the better combat to Chivalry 2. MORDHAU combat is neither beginner friendly nor appealing for high-level players. In fact, the combat has become very niche, where it is mostly appealing to mid-tier players, while they fight other mid-tier players and newer players. Ideally someday we will have a medieval slasher game that satisfies both casual and competitive players. But until then, I think Chivalry 2 has the better combat if you are new to the genre or a casual player that just wants medieval battles with an accessible melee combat system. Next, we have character, armor and weapon customization. The ability to create medieval warriors and dress them up nicely is more than half the game for some players. When it comes to being a good medieval fashion simulator, MORDHAU is state of the art, and you can choose between a huge amount of different armor pieces and create a truly unique warrior. Items, with only very few exceptions, can only be bought with in-game currency that can only be obtained via playing the game. Chivalry 2, on the other hand, is way more restrictive in terms of customization. The game has 4 main classes that each have access to several different armor sets. You can only swap out full body armor sets, whereas helmets can be equipped separately. Armor in MORDHAU is very diverse. You have all kinds of armor pieces from different time periods, and there are also lots of options for roleplay outfits, like for example a monk robe or a jester outfit. Same goes for weapon customization, as the game lets you combine different weapon parts freely. MORDHAU also has a character creator that lets you adjust the body type and create a unique face. Chivalry 2 goes with presets for the face and has no body type options, but also features female face presets. In general, I think armor and weapon skins look better in MORDHAU than in Chivalry 2. Chivalry 2 armor and weapons don't look as clean and have more of a fantasy touch to it, whereas in MORDHAU they look more realistic. MORDHAU's customization freedom doesn't only have advantages though. For once, lots of people run around in meme loadouts, which is not ideal if you want to create immersive medieval battles. And having complete freedom with mixing armor tiers and weapons also brings balancing issues. So from a gameplay perspective, I can see why having some restrictions can be beneficial. On the other hand, having lots of customization options is very good for the roleplay community. But anyway, the point for better character customization clearly goes to MORDHAU. That brings us to the last category in this comparison video, developer support. MORDHAU was for the most part of its lifetime developed by a small team that worked remotely. Triternian always talked about how their company structure prevents them from hiring more people to work on their game. Development progress and updates have always been super slow, and everything from communication with the community to fixing bugs and balance issues in a timely manner showed the inexperience of the team. Now, a few years later, Triternian has about 20 developers and a studio. But since the release of part 2 of their Eastern Invasion update, it is pretty safe to say that Triternian's main focus has shifted away from MORDHAU and the company is focusing on a new game. I wouldn't call it abandoned yet, but going forward, I also wouldn't really expect more than 1 or maybe 2 smaller updates per year. But honestly, one cannot blame them at this point, even though some people within the community are very upset. MORDHAU's player base gets smaller and game sales lower. At some point it would get too expensive to continue to work on a game, and it is time to move on to another project. Big combat changes would come too late at this point and would just upset the remaining player base that enjoys the game the way it is. There is also no magical content that they could add that would suddenly make the game flourish again. With the release of the official modding tools, the devs basically gave it in the hands of the community to create content. Chivalry 2, on the other hand, just had its Steam release this year after a 1-year Epic Games Store exclusivity deal. Thornbanner is the bigger and more professional studio, and according to their website, there are still tons of open positions for hire. They also seem to be motivated and capable to pump out new content for the game. During their first year on the market, they have released 5 content updates. So the point for the better dev support clearly goes to Chivalry 2. Alright, time for some resume. Even though Chivalry 2 wins 3 out of 5 categories in this comparison, at the end of the day, your decision which game to buy or play comes down to what you want from the game. I recommend Chivalry 2 for players that want casual, immersive, large-scale medieval battles and a game that gets frequent updates. Chivalry 2 has a much lower entry barrier, and it is great for people that want to experience medieval fights without the need to practice and overthink the combat. MORDHAU combat is less casual friendly and has more combat mechanics to practice that can create large skill gaps between you and your opponent. Competitive play is pretty bad in both games. And lastly, MORDHAU is the game for you if you want role-playing, modding, or just hanging out in private communities. Personally, I think that it is good that we have different games in this genre to choose from, and the success of MORDHAU and Chivalry 2 also inspires other development studios and teams to jump on the medieval slasher market. But anyway guys, that's it for this comparison. Which game do you prefer and why? Let me know your thoughts in the video description below. If you enjoyed watching, then please leave a like and hit the subscribe button to not miss out on any future medieval slasher content. As always, thank you all for watching and see you soon.